Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome also to everyone who's been kind enough to join us. And today we'll get started on the breakout room sessions for the conference. So it's my honour to introduce Haryanti Afanda, who is a senior lecturer at the National University of Malaysia. And she'll be kind enough to talk us through her presentation, which will be looking at exploring barriers and the way forward in managing Malaysian industry institution partnerships. All right, so just to set out the structure, it will be roughly 20 minutes for the presentations and then 10 minutes at the end. And as I've said, Haryanti, what I'll do is I won't interrupt you while you're talking, but I'll just put a 2-minute warning in the chat, okay, so that you see that. And if everyone else could just do the favour of withholding the questions till the end, and I'll do my best to get through everyone and allow people the opportunity to speak before we move on to the second speaker. All right, so feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Hi everybody and good morning. Actually it's 5:45 evening in Malaysia right now. I'm Haryanti Muhammad Afandi from the Department of Engineering and Education, Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment, the National University of Malaysia. And today I would like to share our research finding, and this research has been funded by the Higher Education Leadership Academy in Malaysia. It is believed that there is issues in the lack of involvement and collaboration by the industry within the TVET ecosystem in Malaysia. The tradition by working in silo cause issues in the labour market comprising skill gaps, graduates unemployment, dependency on low skill, issues on equality and labour market regulation. Therefore, this study aims to explore the barriers on the TVET institution and industry collaboration and defines the way forward to improve this partnership. This study adopted a concurrent mixed method design where the quantitative and qualitative phase are conducted parallelly. A set of questionnaire containing Likert scale questions and open-ended questions was developed to explore the barriers in managing institution and industry partnership. The Likert scale questionnaire survey consists 2 sections, which number 1 for the TVET institution director managerial skill was determined by adapting CARD's managerial skill 1979 model, which have 3 constructs, which are technical skill, human skill, and conceptual skill. Meanwhile, for the Likert scale instrument for identifying common barriers in managing TVET institution were adapted from several previous research, and this section comprises 4 main constructs, which are industry institution cultural issues, management issues in collaboration, funding and financial issue, and governance issue. A total of 83 responses received from TVET institution and industries all around Malaysia, and the data was analyzed using Rush measurement model and Atlas TI. Okay, this research uncovered 2 types of barriers in managing industries institution partnership, which are common barriers and managerial skills barriers. Common barriers refer to the external barriers that influence the industry's institution partnership. Meanwhile, managerial skill barriers are the internal factor among the TVET institution directors in managing industry institution partnership. And this research identified that technical skill are the main barriers that persist among TVET institution director. Meanwhile, we did determine 9 common barriers in this research comprises industry institution culture issue, curriculum, governance issue, communication system, funding and financial issue, geographical distance, industry perspective, current issue, and facilities. as mentioned in previous slide, the main problem exists in managerial skill is among TVET institution is technical skill. And CARD suggested that technical skill are skill required more than in the lower management level than the conceptual level. However, governance structure in Malaysian education system comprises two levels, which is micro and macro level. A TVET institution director falls into the micro governance and practice high management level. The common practices in Malaysia are TVET institution director will be promoted to the managerial position after they have shown themselves to be technically competent. Even though they possess the high management skill, in the micromanagement governance level, this director must have technical skill because this skill allow the director to train, direct and evaluate subordinates performing specialized tasks. This study identified 5 main barriers appear in the technical skill among TVET institution director, which are the ability to implement knowledge, computer skill, employee vocational training, managerial knowledge and experience, and method and technique performance monitoring tools. If you can see here, computer skill has become one of the main barriers in the technical skill. Life in today's generation involved computer skill. And without the use of computer and internet, educational services and many other fields or profession is impossible to do daily life works. Therefore, an administrator has to be technologically advanced to facilitate their transaction or encounter with their staff personnel and able to apply the knowledge and get hands-on practice. Technical managerial skills are essential for any reason. It is believed that being a director or manager in educational setting can act as an effective leader and problem solver in many complex and straightforward situations. Meanwhile, strategic and long-term goals is the barrier identified happen in conceptual skill. It's appear that the director has problem in establishing a shared understanding of the objective, project goals, and develop and execute strategy plans throughout the whole corporation. Moreover, inter-organizational relation were identified as barrier in human skill. It is believed that there is a failure in facilitating the flow of knowledge between partners. It's mean that the director doesn't play a significant role in institution to absorb knowledge from the industries. Okay. For the common barriers exist in TVET institution and industry partnership, we did identify 9 common barriers, comprises industry institution culture issue, curriculum governance issue, communication system, funding and financial issue, geographical distance, industry perspective, current issue, and facility. The cultural misunderstanding among stakeholders contribute to the conflict in engaging the collaboration program. Various TVET providers often operate in silo. This has happened in Malaysia, resulting in programs overlapping and creating confusion among students and employer. It is believed that the lack of industry input in curriculum design has resulted in the mismatch of skills required by industry and the skill attained by the TVET graduate, which has led to the negative industry perspective. Added with the geographical distance issue among TVET institution and industries has worsened the success of the institution-industry collaboration. Finally, the current COVID-19 situation has added a curb to the industry initiative to collaborate because what matters now is to sustain their business. Okay, now we go to the way forward. Okay, to overcome the barriers in managerial skill among directors, it is suggested for the directors to undergo the competency training through industrial attachment. Based on the respondent opinion, industrial attachment can help the director to upgrade their management, corporate and communication skill. Other than that, the respondents saw the importance of the role of ministry to enhancing the policy in establishing the TVET institution and industry partnership. Moreover, the respondents suggested that the government should allocate reward or incentive for the industries that collaborate with institutions. It is believed that this will boost the motivation among industries to collaborate more with the institution. Furthermore, autonomy was also being stated as one of the suggestions to overcome the barriers in managing institution and industry partnership. Because with autonomy, any memorandum of understanding approval process will be done at institution level without any bureaucratical issue in ministry level. Okay, next, there was suggestion that on the need of industry to visit the institution and appoint this institution as their accredited training center. This will help institutions to have proper equipment and assist the expert in the teaching learning session, especially in operating the industrial machine wheel. This will help to overcome the technology gaps between institution and industry to produce competent graduates for the respective field. Furthermore, it is suggested that industry and institution must collaborate in developing an appropriate module to cater the current needs. Besides the modules, the student must be equipped with a clear career path to produce competent workers for the nation. I think that's all from me. Thank you. You need to unmute your... Paul, I can't hear you.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next speaker. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Kristen, I think you're up next, unless we've got any questions in the chat, which I don't know if we do. So if you've got any, do pop them in now. Alternatively, we
I could ask one. I do have a question.
Oh, go for it.
Can I ask, are there industries which are maybe doing better or are more open to collaboration? I know in Australia there's certain industries like manufacturing that maybe is more open to that. Is that the case where you are as well?
Yes. Obviously, the manufacturing industry is very open for the collaboration rather than other industries, because manufacturing is the main industry in Malaysia. Yeah, only that, because we have the dual national system in Malaysia for vocational education, but it's focusing on the manufacturing industry only.
We can't hear you, Paul, so I don't know what's happened to... Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Apologies, I've had some technical issues this morning, which is sort of the problem of working from home. But yeah, sorry, I would just, does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to come in with at this point? Anyone? I mean, from a practical perspective, Haryanti, just because it's something that I'm considering within my own research, because I'm now beginning to conduct it, has there been any sort of negative impact of the pandemic on your attempts to conduct this research, and particularly when you're engaging with employers?
Pardon me, Paul?
Has there been any negative impact of the pandemic on the practicalities of you conducting your research?
Yes, obviously. We did identify that most of the industries are not accepting the on-job training student, the practical student.
Right.
So they need to extend the semester. But the positive thing happened, the knowledge sharing between the industry and academic is increasing through the online platform. We have a lot of webinar for knowledge sharing from the industry to the student through institutional online platform. So that's the only one positive thing happened during COVID. Other than that, I think there's a lot of us suffering through COVID.
Right, okay. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Does anyone else have anything that they would like to ask about the research? Okay, so we'll get a bit more time left. I guess we'll just continue on because I know that you know, sometimes these things go longer, sometimes they're shorter, and usually it evens out. But thank you so much again. That was extremely interesting. I very much enjoyed hearing about it, particularly within a different context to what I would understand and you know, conduct my research in. So I found it fascinating. So thank you very much,
Thank you.
and very well done. All right. What I'll do is I'll keep the introductions brief, just because, as I say, to make sure that I don't eat up other people's time. So I'll pass over to Kristen Osborne, who can explain her own research. And Kristen, I'll just do the same again, okay? I'll time it, I won't interrupt you, but if it gets to 20 minutes, I'll put it in the chat, okay? Good luck.
Thank you for that. All right. Screen sharing good? Yep, okay. Excellent. All right, let me go ahead. So first, let me thank the team for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the lands of the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains in South Australia, where I am, and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. This is the topic of my little discussion today, which is work-based education in the context of Australian vocational education and training. A little bit of background, because I'm definitely not expecting people are familiar with the Australian VET system. I work for the National Centre for Vocational Education Research in Australia, and we collect and hold data on all vocational education in Australia. So 4.4 million students roughly, and we have, by law, training providers have to provide to us data on all the enrolments and completions. So we're in a really fortunate position in that we have all that data and we can do some pretty exciting things with it. And as I go along, I'll certainly try and discuss things in a way that makes it really easy to understand from a global perspective and not use anything that's too specific to Australia, but I think it's all, you know, I think we're all talking the same language here. So this is just the brief where I'm going to be going. Some quick definitions, because when I started on this research, and I'm certainly not by training a super expert in the workplace education space, but I found the definitions quite interesting and quite sometimes difficult to nail down. And then mainly what I'll be discussing is the actual use of workplace-based delivery in Australia and what I found out of that. And hopefully maybe some discussion at the end about how it's similar or different to other people's experiences of how it's being used. And then also, as part of this suite of work, we did a bit of a collation of national and international information on what the challenges are for the workplace-based education, what the benefits are, and then some best practice. So I sort of wanted to end on that because I think that's interesting, and I think it's an interesting spot for a bit of discussion, see if those things resonate with people. Two broad concepts, one of which is the overarching idea of work-based education, which is just the structured education program that includes learning through work. In Australia, we often use language like apprenticeships and traineeships. I mean, that's a global thing as well, but I would say a huge volume of it is going on in paid and unpaid work placements as part of training. So that's kind of the broader definition. Like I mentioned, NCVR has this big body of data, and one of the things that we can look at is the mode of delivery. So within every subject, students have, the training provider has to define the delivery mode, how it was delivered. And one of the modes we can look at is workplace-based delivery. So that's where the training itself was in the workplace. It might be conducted by the employer, it might be conducted by the training organisation. So that's really the specific definition we wanted to focus in for this project. And that includes your sort of traditional apprenticeships, placements, on-the-job training, structured workplace training at the place of employment. But it doesn't include the kind of more marginal areas of maybe simulated workplace training, which is very interesting, but not super relevant for this. All right, let me get into it. So, like I said, 4.4 million students in Australia studying programs which are made up of subjects. And so they're mostly studying more than one subject because obviously, you know, if you're doing a diploma, you have multiple subjects. So about 26.5 million subjects in 2019. And this graph just shows you the split. So you've got the green, about 80% no workplace-based delivery at all, and then the blue 20% workplace-based delivery. And I would say, and this maybe is a bit of a broad assumption, but I'd say the main mode of engagement for employers in actual training is through this mechanism of workplace-based delivery. So most subjects don't have a workplace-based component. I mean, I don't want to suggest that inherently everything has to have one, and it's always better, but you know, there are some benefits. But about 5.5 million subjects had some workplace-based delivery. And so just to come back to that topic of the delivery mode, you can have a mixed delivery mode where you do some of your training in the classroom and then some on the work site. You might do it all in the workplace, or you might do it all online, say, and none of it anywhere else. So that's the options. It's sort of a mix and match, but we've got about 20% that had any workplace delivery, and we excluded for this things like the recognition of prior learning or credit transfer where there's no delivery going on. All right. I'll be interested to know if this is similar in other places, but apprenticeships and traineeships in Australia are the culturally dominant way of integrating work with training. They're not the only way, and they're actually not even necessarily the most popular way, but they're certainly very culturally dominant. So when you talk about work-based training or training in the workplace or training while employed, apprenticeships and traineeships are kind of the concept used a lot. And I was interested to see if that translates into all of the work-based delivery or workplace-based delivery going on in Australia, taking place within those types of programs. And those types of programs in Australia are highly structured and involve contracts of training, and they're often longer form as well. So what we found is, no, actually there's a huge amount of workplace-based training going on outside of these programs, outside of these formal arrangements. So the darker bar on the left is the proportion that were not an apprenticeship or traineeship, and then the lighter bar on the right was apprenticeships and traineeships. So this is the proportion of subjects with any workplace-based delivery at all. So about 75% of those subjects that had some form of workplace-based delivery weren't taking place within formal apprenticeships and traineeships. And I found that really interesting, because I think the expectation was that it would be heavily focused and integrated within those formal, I guess, employer education relationships, but it seems a lot broader than that. And it seems that because most training isn't an apprenticeship or traineeship, most training within the workplace also isn't part of an apprenticeship or traineeship. So that was quite interesting to have a look at. Going to levels of education, and this was another interesting thing. I think it could have gone either way. I've just put a couple of frameworks there, the Australian qualification framework next to the EQF. It's pretty similar in that your Cert 1s and 2s are very low level entry subjects, more foundational skills, preparatory courses. Certificate 3 is the level most apprenticeships are undertaken at, plumbing apprenticeships, carpentry apprenticeships, 6 months to 12-month courses, and then Certificate 4, diploma, and then above diploma are higher level courses. So there's two ways of thinking about this. One is that certificate 1s and 2s, because they're often preparatory in nature and talk about employment skills, foundational skills, pathways, they often do include some kind of placement. But what we saw was it was at the certificate 3 and 4 level, the slightly higher level, maybe where a lot more proportionally, there was a lot more workplace-based delivery going on. So this was quite interesting. So you're looking at maybe 24% of certificate 3 subjects having some amount of workplace-based delivery. And interestingly, so the little blue line on the far left of that graph is workplace-based only. So that's where a subject entirely was delivered in the workplace. That's an interesting thing that pops up, because as we'll see in a minute, it tends to be a bit of all or nothing. But yeah, certainly at the certificate 4 and the certificate 5 level, we had a lot more going on, and then a little bit at the diploma level and above. And I will mention now, there's an interesting relationship between the use of workplace-based training in Australia and the requirement for workplace-based training. So there are plenty of qualifications, mainly at the certificate 3, 4 and diploma level, that require it. But there is some at lower levels that require it as well. So one example might be the Diploma of Nursing. You're absolutely required to do a workplace-based component when you study the Diploma of Nursing. It's not an apprenticeship or a traineeship though. Then there are other qualifications where it's highly recommended. So that's an interesting little quirk where it's like, it's more the training organisation making that decision. But yeah, so taking place at that kind of middling level, probably an initial qualification would be at the certificate 3 or 4 level. That's where the much higher rates of workplace-based training were going on. And so that means that it's much more likely for a vocational student in Australia's first experience of workplace-based training to be at those levels. So even if they have studied a certificate 1 or 2 as part of a pathways program, they might not have necessarily got any training in the workplace, which is interesting and maybe something to consider, particularly if a student is on a pathway to an apprenticeship or to a qualification that is going to include a lot of workplace training, because the earlier I think you can give those students the experience of it, the better the outcomes might be. This is a nice little graph here with a U shape. So along the bottom, we have the proportion of workplace-based delivery within qualifications, and we have about 1,500 qualifications in the Australian system. We think that that's a lot. Generally, it's talked about as that being too much, but that's for other people to decide. And then on the y-axis, or the size of those bars, is the number of qualifications. So what it means is basically there were 514 qualifications with pretty much no workplace-based learning going on within them. You know, that might be the certificate of 3 in visual arts had nothing in any of none of the students studying that had any workplace-based training. And then on the other side, you see 149 qualifications that were between 90 and 100% workplace-based. So there are definitely qualifications that take place entirely on the basis of workplace-based training. And actually, they're not necessarily apprenticeships. One example is the certification in train driving. That's entirely workplace-based. It's not necessarily required to be, but you are required to be employed as a train driver to train it. So you actually have to get an employer to take you on and say, yeah, we'll let you work, we'll supervise you as you upskill through undertaking the qualification. And basically what I'm trying to get at here is this U-shaped distribution. So qualifications tend to either not really use it, or use a little bit of workplace-based training, or use a lot of it. And really that's the focal point, or I guess that's how that's structured to be delivered. And again, we're not sort of looking at apprenticeships and traineeships here. This is outside of that space. So there's no contract of training. There's no employment that's predicated on training in the workplace. Yeah, so a little bit going on in that middle level, but mostly, obviously, most qualifications not really having much workplace component, and there's some qualifications very heavily reliant on that. Just click back a bit to round up this kind of quantitative section. We also, and I'm not kind of going into it in depth here, but we also did a bit of regression analysis to understand the factors that were predicting workplace-based training. And we found a really strong connection, but I guess, between the industry or the field of training and if there was training taking place in the workplace. So I guess what would say from that is that some industries and some fields of training were 100% in favour of, I guess, that workplace-based training, or the expectation was that would be taking place, and there was requirements for it, and that was driven really heavily by the field of education. So other fields of education, I know this can be also part of cultural expectations. For example, in Australia, if you do any of the qualifications in the kind of cookery or baking area, but you don't do placements, you actually disadvantaged as a student. That's the heavy industry cultural expectation, that you should have workplace-based training. Other qualifications, say a certificate in business, they're not necessarily as bothered. So that was interesting, and I'd be interested to chat with people more, I guess, about if the engagement of industry is reliant on what that industry is and what that industry's expectations are about how much workplace-based training a student should be getting. All right, going to sum up now some of the points that we collated as part of a sort of review of best practice, and I'll show you the report at the end so you can go away and get it if you're interested. We did talk about best practice for a range of groups, for training organisations, for students, for policymakers, but I wanted to focus on these points for employers here because it is, you know, I think most relevant to the topic of this conference. The biggest takeaway we found in our investigations and when I was talking to people in the context of Australian VET was the need for teamwork, collaboration and communication. So situations, case studies where I found or where I talked to people where the training providers, the host organisations and the students were communicating and setting clear expectations were the most successful. And I did a little bit of analysis of what students say once they complete a qualification about their workplace-based training. And students, if the student was going to make a complaint, it might be around it wasn't organised clearly or the expectations weren't set to me. So this is clearly something that's really important for students. This, I think, ties really nicely back to the preceding presentation, which was about that we found investing in training for workplace mentors could be really important. And I'd say ideally here with support from government or other organisations, it can be a big burden, particularly on small or medium businesses to mentor someone in the workplace, and certainly that's an even bigger burden to have to train someone to then do the mentoring, but that can be really useful. And I guess it's that old adage of, you know, someone could be an expert in something, but it doesn't mean they're an expert in teaching it. And I think that that can come through a little bit. Establishing clear expectations was something that came up as really important so that students knew what they were in for, knew what they were expecting, and trying to value student contributions. NCBR did a little bit of work, probably a few years ago now, on what value students could actually provide to host organisations. And they found that students were often more up to date, I guess, in terms of some latest techniques or attitudes or tools. And if host organisations were really listening to students, they could get some learnings themselves. So it wasn't just a one-way street, it was an exchange, I guess. Giving students challenging work, appropriately challenging work, and collaborating on curriculum design were also factors that came out. And engaging in different kinds of workplace programs. So there were situations in which employers had come on board to work with training organisations for programs that maybe were taking place within the organisation or in other spots, but they were still providing the benefit of their experience, and it was fostering more of a relationship between the employer and the training organisation. So that was really useful. All right, let's wrap it up a little bit. So there is a significant volume of workplace-based delivery happening in Australia outside of the traditional apprenticeship structure, which I think is good because I think workplace-based delivery can really help students. The inclusion of this delivery tends to be heavy or light. Qualifications, and I think this really goes to both the way the qualifications and the curriculum is structured, but also the expectations of training organisations, teachers and industry. It's either really a hugely core component to a student's learning or really marginal and perhaps not used at all. Little of this workplace-based delivery is taking place at lower qualification levels. And, you know, I can make some guesses around why the reasons that might be. Employers might be more hesitant to engage students at those lower levels, maybe feeling that they can't contribute enough or that they're going to be a burden in the workplace. I would dispute that, but that might be the perception. It also might be the case that that's harder to arrange. So these lower qualification levels are often much shorter in terms of their delivery time. Less than 6 months, less than 3 months. Some of them take place over a few weeks. And so arranging, say, a work placement is going to be a lot of work compared to the amount of time. So they might have tours of work sites or they might have exposure in other ways that don't kind of count as learning on the job. Here is the first report that we've put out as a result of this project. So this is more the overview of what the challenges are for work-based education in VET, it's got enough of, I think, of a global perspective that international audiences will find it useful as well, even though it's got an Australian focus. We certainly reached out to lots of research from all over the world and used a fair amount, I think, actually, of European research in this. And it also sets out those best practice ideas for a range of stakeholders. So you can go ahead and grab that one if you're interested. A little bit later this year, we'll be putting out the second part, which is more of the quantitative stuff I've just shown and some of our regression analysis. So if you go to the NCVR website or follow us on socials, then you can stay connected and see that when that comes out. And of course, I put in there my contact details because I'm always keen to have conversations with people about this. There's the references in there, and then I will stop sharing in case anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Kristen. That was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And I have quite a few questions of my own jotted down, but as the host, I probably have a responsibility to ask others first. So I'll let, I see Sarah had her hand up, and then I'll come to the person that posted in the chat. Sarah, if you want to start us off.
Hi, I don't know if that was me. I did a little clap. That was the clap reaction.
Ah, right, sorry.
But I can see Makeba has a question.
You're on mute.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay now?
Perfect.
Apologies. Kirsten, that was great. It was a really great insight into the system in Australia. My name is Ricky McCabe. I work for an organisation called Skills Development Scotland. We're the skills funding agency for Scottish Government in Scotland. I thought it was really interesting, a really interesting insight into how you guys do things in Australia. And I had a couple of questions based on what you had shared. First of all, I wondered how, obviously one of the biggest challenges that we've faced over the last year has been COVID and the delivery of programmes, particularly where learners have to enter the workplace. So I wondered how, from an Australian perspective, how you guys have got around that. Is there any particular changes that you've had to make to your qualifications to enable workplace activity to happen? So for example, and certainly from a Scottish perspective, one of the kind of programmes that we worked on, myself and some of the other guys I think are on the call, has been the Foundation Apprenticeship Programme, whereby traditionally learners would go into the workplace. For COVID last year, we were able to work with the Qualifications Authority in Scotland to kind of make some changes to our qualifications to allow greater flexibility in how that workplace activity was conducted, so potentially online and through the delivery of projects. So I just wondered how, from an Australian perspective, you guys had managed that. And secondly, my second question is around a big part of work-based learning that I'm very passionate about is project or challenge-based learning, whereby an employer will set a project at the start of a year with a cohort of learners in a specific sectoral area, and those learners will work closely with that employer over an academic year to deliver a project with support and interventions from that employer to really bring that industry insight and focus to the delivery and making it more kind of industry relevant to the learners, and then potentially to create a pathway as well so that learners get that opportunity to perhaps move into modern apprenticeships with that employer or further learning and things like that. So I just wondered if you could give us a bit more insight to that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So in Australia, the Australian Industry Skills Council, which I'm guessing is probably similar to the organisation you work for, did put out some guidance around that. And actually NCVR conducted a bit of quick research around mandatory work placement. So I will say Australia has been very, very fortunate. And so the nature of lockdowns and shutdowns in Australian industry has been, I think, very different to the rest of the world. Really, the only industries that were strongly affected were the health and early childhood education and care industries. But certainly, particularly in Victoria, you've probably heard that in Victoria, there was an extended lockdown, and aged care facilities and health facilities completely stopped taking students. And obviously that's a concern when those qualifications, it's mandatory to complete placement before you can qualify. And that's not just for nursing, but that's for lower level positions like the Certificate 3, those mid-entry level positions. And that was a problem. And last year, I spoke to a lot of training organisations that had backed up students that had finished their theory component and were waiting to go on the job. Mm-hmm. The way we talked about addressing that, certainly the AISC talked about flexibility, And they put out some guidelines around when it might be appropriate to use some simulated learning, or when the work-based component might not be able to be used. Generally in the health sector, that was not taken up, in that we understand the need for that real world activity. There was also a lot of work between training organisations and industry organisations to see where placements could go ahead, and adapting the way in which placements were taking place. So one example is in the early childhood sector. Now that industry didn't shut down necessarily, because that was considered to be essential. So there was still early childhood education and care ongoing, particularly for children of essential workers. So students could theoretically go to placements there, but trainers and assessors were not allowed on the premises in order to mitigate COVID risk. So what was going on was more digital assessment. In one case, trainers and assessors were standing outside the window to view the students, and just kind of workarounds like that. We're lucky enough now that things have eased up and people are really able to get those placements moving. But yeah, those adaptations were a big concern, and I think depending on the nature, and certainly an issue in Australia is that every state and territory gave their own advice, and some in Victoria the government banned placement students, so the government banned it. It wasn't a matter of an option. In a lot of other states and territories, it was just up to the organisation, and a lot of organisations were risk averse and decided not to. So there was a lot of reshuffling. There was guidance from the AISC about how in some cases placements needed to be deferred, but in some cases they could go ahead with adapted management, and that's kind of how things unfolded in Australia. So thankfully now I think we're up to a position where we've had to not take cohorts at the beginning of the year for some of those health professions, but we're kind of back on track. So I hope that answers that. The other part, just quickly on, I would say the project and those kind of longer term project-based things happening much more in higher education or at higher degree levels in Australia. So there is an interest in, particularly, we have what we call dual sector institutions, universities that deliver accredited vocational education and training. So they deliver bachelor degree, master's degree, but also diplomas and certificates. And those organisations are more interested in higher education, so graduate certificates or bachelor degrees, where there is that really heavily integrated component. There's also an interest, a kind of bubbling interest in what we call higher apprenticeships in Australia. So higher level, maybe diploma or advanced diploma apprenticeships with that strong vocational approach that is project based. So I think that's where that discussion is going on in Australia at the moment, less so at those entry level jobs.
I mean, certainly for us, I think in terms of the kind of project-based learning, we've been piloting project-based learning programmes at SCQF level 4 and 5, which I think is like early high school for some, and then going into kind of your kind of latter stages of high school, depending on the individual needs of the learner. Certainly from my own perspective, I think it's really useful for the learners at an earlier stage, because the learners, for me, sometimes, depending on who the learner is, they might not necessarily engage with the traditional style of classroom activity. So taking that project and contextualising the learning for things like maths and science actually allows learners to really understand from a practical perspective what it means, instead of the whole traditional, I'm going back and show my age here, learning on a chalkboard and things like that. So I think it's really useful from that perspective.
And that makes a lot of sense when you think about those principles I mentioned of setting the learner appropriate challenges and giving the opportunity to be to feel like they're making an impact or making a contribution. You know, they're not just coming onto the job and doing this and that task that they're directed to, but here's an actual project, you're going to make a contribution to the workplace.
I think from an industry perspective as well, certainly industry finds that our research has shown, and the evaluation of these pilots has shown, that industry are seeing it as a real benefit, because learners are then coming to industry with a real in-depth knowledge of what that industry is about, the roles within it, and they're then, on completion of school in the senior phase, making more informed career decisions about where they're going next and the steps they're taking, plus the opportunities to potentially get, as I said earlier, apprenticeships and things, which is really beneficial. So listen, that was great. Thank you very much, Kirsten. It was a great response. Thank you.
Thanks for that. You've stole most of my questions there as well, Mr. McKeever, because I was going to ask in relation to the Foundation Apprenticeships, but that's great. I'm glad they were answered. I'll put it to Lulu now, who I can see has their hand up, if you're able to come in and ask away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen, for your presentation. That was quite clear and very interesting. What I just want to find out is, you raised that there is training whereby they only train in the workplace, whereby students get trained in the workplace. For example, you gave an example of train drivers. Is there a particular formal curriculum that they follow in the training? And are these students at the end of the training, are they guaranteed to get employment in the company? And the last part of the question is, do they get a certificate? Or are they able to like go further? Say, for example, after the training, if they want to go, say, for example, they are completed, they want to get into university, can they use that training to go further in their education to go to university or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, sorry, are you finished?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So the structure of Australian VET is that all nationally recognised training and all nationally recognised qualifications, at the end you do receive a certificate, and that is nationally recognised, as I keep saying. And all of that also has to abide by structures. So we have industry reference councils, we have the Australian Industry Skills Committee, and we have these training packages, and that defines within a program what subjects you have to study and what competency outcomes you have to achieve within those subjects. And all of that still applies no matter how much workplace-based training you have. Now, there's a whole other discussion in Australia. There's a lot of, and I'm sure it's similar wherever you are, about if it's too prescriptive or if it's not prescriptive enough, a curriculum. You know, if it's too prescriptive, it says you have to teach in this way to have these learning outcomes, or if it's not enough. But yeah, no matter how much workplace-based learning you have, if it's an accredited qualification, you will get that and you'll be able to take it on. My understanding of these courses that have a really heavy employment-based component is, yes, the employer is basically making a commitment that they're going to employ you because they've spent so much time training you. So a little anecdote is in Australia, the area of funeral services is actually in very high demand. We have a lot of students that want to go into funeral services, funeral directors or mortuary assistants. And those qualifications are of this type, where really in order to begin training, you have to have that discussion with an employer that is willing to take you on, not as an apprentice, but to give you somewhere to undertake your workplace-based training. And often, or sometimes, the training organisations themselves will be operating businesses. So there might be a business that's operating in the funeral services industry and also delivering training, I guess, internally. And I think that's probably a lot of what's going on with these entirely workplace-based qualifications. But yeah, they're 100% nationally recognised and transferable, so the student can then take that on, or they get that certification at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Kristen. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask at this point?
I have one question, Kristen. May I know, does the structure of work-based education in Australia is train and hire? Or if not, how you want to make sure that the school to work transition succeed?
Yeah, so so we have in Australia a program called, so there's the subsection of Australian VET that mainly deals with the school to employment transition. We have a VET in schools, which is vocational education that's being delivered in the school context, and that's kind of a little bit separate and different to other kinds. There is a big focus on that workplace component in schools, I think, because something has maybe been alluded to before. It's really useful for students who find it difficult to apply those kind of academic learnings in a real world way, and maybe they feel disillusioned. So the education taking place in schools can be at the certificate 1 and 2 level, but it is also at the certificate 3 level, and students can get that workplace-based element. I think what we're seeing more and more is that employers are incredibly keen and almost demanding that someone have work experience before they employ them. And that's, you know, that's a paradox, isn't it? I certainly remember I was out of uni, you know, applying for my first real jobs, and I was told, oh, well, you have to have experience. I'm like, how do I get experience? You know, no one will take me for a job, so I can get the experience so I can get a job. And I think one way in which is that's trying to be addressed is through placements, through work placements for people when they're, maybe that's that first qualification, and that helps with that school to employment transition, is that they're given some of those on-the-job trainings and just that general cultural knowledge about, you know, what it's like to be in a workplace, what it's like to turn up on time, and the different demands in a workplace, the different social aspects of being in a workplace as well. But that is a very good question that is definitely, you know, it's not a solved issue at all in Australia. Just a quick plug, if you go onto the NCVR website, I did do a piece a couple of years ago on the school to vet transitions and choosing vet in Australia. And it's an interesting issue, and it's a little fraught because actually research has found that students that want a career that requires vocational training think they're going to go to university and then become part of that career. So they don't kind of even know that, no, you don't go to university to be a plumber. Like, that's not how it works in Australia. You go and you have vocational training to go and be a plumber. And so there's some confusion there even as well, but that's a whole other topic.
Excellent. Thank you for the question, Haryanti, and thank you again, Kristen, for answering that. Do we have any other questions from anyone on the panel today? No. The only other thing, Kristen, I picked up on, I thought it was interesting that you made the point that, you know, best practice would include greater investment in direct sort of mentorship programs within organisations. And I may have just missed it, so excuse me if I did. But is that coming from, you know, the students themselves, or is that bore out in statistics in terms of completion rates, that's a preferable option?
In terms of why we think workplace mentoring is more important, that came from the literature reviews. So that came from the international reviews of literature on success, and when I guess student placements were successful.
Right. Okay.
Completion rates are really, I don't know if this is different in other places, but completion rates are very, very hard to use in Australia because we have an issue where students will enroll in whole programs and only intend to complete part of it because they only need part of it for their employment. Right. So it's a fraught area. Okay.
No, I'm glad you cleared
one
that.
last question, please, because I've done a similar research like Kristen. Can the work-based education be calculated as a working experience during the working interview? Because in Malaysia, we did identify some of the employer counted the work-based education as a working experience, but most of them are not. So how about in Australia?
I would say generally not. I think employers tend to think of it as it's useful if you've done, say, a work placement during your training, but they wouldn't necessarily consider it as like full work experience. I think there's a real attitude, and this is just me talking generally culturally, I think there's an attitude that it's not real work experience unless you were paid for it, because everyone wants someone else to take the risk, right? So they want to say, oh, well, if someone else has paid you, you know, we know you're a good worker. The way we've kind of dealt with that is longer, or moves towards longer placements or longer experience. So an unpaid internship that's maybe a little bit longer in form, and where the employer can kind of see that. I will say quickly, we found a huge tendency for workplaces, once they became engaged in this process of taking on placement students, they would basically use that as a try before you buy. So they loved it when they got in a new crop of placement students, or even small and medium businesses that could only take on one or two, because often they would say, oh yeah, this student was great, and they hired them as soon as they had completed their work. So that was a really valuable pathway, and it was an interesting way to sell that to employers, I guess, that, you know, everyone wants to hire someone good. If you take this person on for placement, well, you don't have to pay them while you're trying them out. It's no strings attached, so at the end of their training they can leave. But if you like them and they already know your business, then there's a fully qualified person there ready for you to take and could contribute to your organisation.
Excellent. That's funny, Kristen, because that's exactly the sort of thing I was getting back from employers when I was researching the foundation apprenticeships that Mr. McCaber spoke about. So I assume that's something that can apply in different national contexts and so on. Do we have any final questions, or are we happy to let Kristen finish up? Okay, excellent. Kristen, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Very well done. Okay. So next up is myself, I believe, and what I'll do is I'll just very quickly share my screen now. Just give me one moment. Sarah, are you able to make me a co-host again, just because I get disconnected? That unfortunately removed that privilege, I believe. Sorted, excellent, thank you. Okay. So can everyone see that? All okay to go? Kristen, you're the only one I can see, so you'll need to give me a thumbs up if you can. Excellent, that's exactly what I needed. Thank you so much. Okay, hello everyone. My name's Paul Quigley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, and I'm partially funded by Skills Development Scotland, the organisation we've discussed within the last session, as well as the Economic and Social Research Council. Today I'll be discussing my PhD thesis, which looks at how do large employers engage with apprenticeships in Scotland. Just give me one moment. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll first provide just a brief overview of the presentation, and then I'll take you through each of the relevant points. I'll provide a research overview, a basis for the research. I'll also explain the apprenticeship levy in a bit of depth. That was a piece of legislation that was introduced by the UK government, but I'll need to, whilst I understand that some people will have quite a good knowledge of it, I'll provide a bit of context for those based outside of the UK. I'll also explain some of the more other relevant policies, particularly incentive schemes that have been devised to incentivise organisations to either keep apprentices or hire apprentices within the context of the COVID pandemic. In terms of other motivating factors, I'll go through this briefly, just in terms of what the research is finding at this stage in regards to what motivates employers when they're considering apprenticeship engagement. I'll then cover the gaps in literature, the need for this particular type of research, outlining the research questions. I'll then explain the typology that I plan to use within the context of the research in order to test the utility of the typology, but also to try and broaden that utility in a way that would hopefully help develop a framework, a blueprint for increasing employer engagement within this field. And finally, I'll just outline the research methods and the point that I'm at just now. Okay, so in terms of the research overview, this project seeks to consider all relevant external and internal factors which impact the decision-making process on apprenticeship engagement. And that's the key point, the decision-making process. When employers get to the stage of deciding whether to engage or not engage with apprenticeships. So what I want to do is delve into the motivating factors when they are making that decision, as well as to understand what impacts the level of that engagement. Now, this would absolutely include a look at the apprenticeship levy that I've mentioned slightly earlier. This project was probably had a narrower focus when it was first conceived. It was understood as a way of trying to evaluate employer perspectives on the apprenticeship levy, but since its conception, clearly things have changed in the world. We are now in a, there's been changes in the labour market, changes in the broader economy, as well as policy changes that will need to be considered as well. So, as I say, the project will seek to understand what impacts the decision to engage, as well as the level of that engagement. So, the apprenticeship levy was a piece of legislation that was introduced by the UK government in 2017, designed to increase the recruitment and training of apprentices. Now, this is understood as a reserved power, meaning that it is set by the UK government, but also applies specifically within a Scottish context. The levy itself applies to employers with an annual salary cost of more than £3 million, and amounts to 0.5% of their yearly wage bill. Okay, this money is then collected, put in a pot, and the money can be reclaimed by employers to pay for apprenticeship training or examination for qualifications. Within early academic studies and literature, the scheme has been quite sharply criticised. Recruitment failed, particularly during the first 2 years, and there are other accusations levied by the EDSK that's actually led to the creation of fake apprenticeships. Whilst many employers have sought to engage in with the policy in face value and good faith, other organisations, it's alleged, there's evidence within various pieces of research, have sought to, rather than create any additionality, create additional apprenticeships and training, have sought to rebadge existing apprenticeships, existing jobs as apprenticeships in an attempt to circumvent the levy and regain the funds without that additionality that the government sought. As I said, the levy is applied in Scotland and managed through Skills Development Scotland, whom we've mentioned. Other incentive policies and schemes that apply in Scotland. Now, first of all, there's the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, introduced by the UK government, which has supported businesses to ensure that they are in a position to keep on employees by offering to pay up to 80% of their salary whilst they're on furlough. That figure has now dropped to 70% as of this morning, I believe, and it will drop further until it finishes, it closes off at the end of September. As a reserve power, that also applies within Scotland. The other policies, however, are very Scotland specific as opposed to UK wide. First of all, there's the Apprenticeship Employer Grant, which ran up until March of this year, from December to March, which offered employers a one-off grant of up to £5,000 if they took on a new apprentice. There were similar schemes in England, however, the grant wasn't quite as substantial as it was within the Scottish context. And in terms of there was a £10 million pot which has been exceeded, and it's helped to employ up to 3,853 apprentices across over 2,000 employers who received the grant. There's also a scheme called the Adopt an Apprentice scheme, which was designed to try and catch those apprentices made redundant, particularly as a result of the pandemic. And again, that's seen a grant be offered to organisations who were able to employ an apprentice who had been made redundant but could continue on their qualifications or work-based training within this new company. And again, that was a success. That scheme just ended just over 1 week ago, and it led to 342 apprentices being rehoused, as it were, within different organisations. Finally, the Workforce Development Fund is a fund set up again to help fund apprentices in work-based learning, and it's helped to fund over 8,000 apprenticeship starts within Scotland over the course of the last year. Now, the piece of research will certainly attempt to consider the impact of these different policy initiatives. How does this impact organisational decision making? But there's also internal motivating factors that have begun to come out of previous research I've conducted, but research that I'm currently conducting as well. Okay, in terms of from the literature, one of the most prominent internal motivating factors is an adherence to human capital theory. In terms of surveys conducted by the Federation of Small Business, as well as a survey conducted within the German labour market, demonstrated that the most significant motivating factor for employees when they're considering engaging with apprenticeships is the idea that they are investing in human capital, investing in the young workforce, and in the hope that the workers would stay with them and provide value to the organisation in years to come. Another issue that came up, though, is that of mimetic isomorphism, the idea that because organisations seek validity within their chosen sector, and again, there's quite a historical backdrop to this within Scotland, that within traditional industries for apprenticeships, organisations quite often engage with apprenticeships because that's what's always been done. That's what their competitors do, that's what's expected of the sector, of the industry, and it's almost continued in a slightly apathetic way, but there is still strong levels of engagement within these particular industries. In terms of a substitution strategy, again, this is something that came from the German survey, which demonstrated that 19% of employers who do engage with apprenticeships do so on the basis of a substitution strategy, which means that they take on apprentices for the duration of their apprenticeship because they can pay them apprentice wages, because they might have other incentive schemes without any intent of actually keeping them on beyond that. And then when the apprentices are finished, they'll be let go and another round of apprentices would come in. And again, Walker wrote about this within the Scottish context in 1979, a practice that was fairly prevalent within Scottish industry and can still be seen to some extent today. One other issue is the polarisation of the workforce, and particularly de-skilling of the workforce. This is one of the things that potentially prevents or acts as a deterrent for organisations. And again, Canning and Lang wrote about this back in 2004, and it has been a potential issue that's cropped up whereby organisations, or some organisations, are less motivated to, as we've said before, develop human capital and are rather happy to have a de-skilled workforce for their organisational needs. I think Kristen spoke about this as well, the negative perception of young workers that exists, this idea, quite stereotypical idea that young workers are unprepared, unready for work, that the new generation entering the workforce has different values. But again, my research has shown that that can go either way, because in some cases, absolutely, organisations are hesitant, especially those who have had negative experiences in the past with apprentices, whereas other organisations may share some of those conceptions about young people, but they see apprenticeships as a way to socialise young people into the workplace and to help them lose some of those habits and to prepare them for the world of work, more absolutely. And finally, levy, apathy and confusion. There's a lot of literature based on this, of employers who initially didn't understand the levy, employers who were hesitant to go near the levy, employers who, as I've said, have regularly sought to circumvent the levy rather than engage with it in a sort of face value manner. Okay, so in terms of the gap in literature and the exact need for this piece of research, as I've said, clearly there exists literature which discusses apprenticeship in Scotland. There's also a growing literature which evaluates the specific impact of the apprenticeship levy. It's important to note, though, that there is limited literature of note which considers the decision-making process of employers when they are making that decision, when they're considering engaging with apprenticeships, and then, as I say, deciding on the level of that engagement. Okay. There is now some literature which evaluates the impact of COVID on apprenticeships. However, at this point, there's not a huge amount within the Scottish context. Therefore, for me, there is a clear gap in understanding of what motivates employers when they're considering apprenticeship engagement, but that is particularly true within the Scottish context, and it's particularly true within light of the pandemic and the new economic and social circumstance within which we find ourselves. Okay, so I'll very quickly just go over the research questions so that you have a good idea of what it is that I'll be aiming to answer and understand. The first of which is, what are the key motivating factors which influence large employers when they are considering engaging apprenticeships? It's particularly, how influential have recent government policies been in impacting these decisions within organisations? Secondly, for those employers who do engage with apprenticeships, what factors determine the level of that engagement? Once again, what policy changes would be effective in increasing apprenticeship engagement of such employers? And then finally, can the typology of Bredgard be used as a useful tool to categorise employers in terms of apprenticeship engagement? And can Bredgard's typology be developed in such a way as to provide a framework for how apprenticeship engagement may be increased? And I'll come into that just now. Okay. Now, Thomas Bredgard was an academic who created this typology in an attempt to categorise and better understand the different types of employers when it comes to active labour market policy engagement. Okay, and when it was created, it was designed to help broaden understanding of how organisational attitudes and level of engagement interact. Okay, and here we have on the axis, and you can see you know, the positive attitude to the negative attitudes, and then engagement or non-engagement. Okay, within that we have 4 distinct categories that you can see that determine whether or not there is engagement and likely impact on the level of that engagement. Okay, now the utility of the framework was created on the engagement of Danish employers, a large legal firm in Denmark, when dealing with a policy introduced by the Danish government around absenteeism. This project, however, will seek to go beyond that. We'll seek to apply this typology within the context of apprenticeships in Scotland, and to try and see if that can be used to usefully categorise employers in terms of their apprenticeship engagement. Now, Bredgar's study was quantitative and, as I've said, was completed using a survey, and it was just intended to do that, simply to categorise and broaden understanding that way, so that there was a better grasp of where employers sat and the percentages whereby employers would be found in each category. This project, however, will go beyond that. Okay, this project will seek to explore whether the typology can be pushed further. Can this framework be used to provide a model for policymakers to successfully shift employers from one category to another? Okay, so can you shift the dismissive employer to become a sceptical employer who may still have a negative attitude of apprenticeships but will engage at that point? Or can you move the passive employer who's quite positive but at that point doesn't engage to the committed employer? Or can you move the sceptical to the committed? Each move would hopefully increase engagement, meeting some of the kind of government targets that were set out by the apprenticeship levy. Okay. In terms of the methods, it will be a qualitative study. The aim is to conduct up to 20 case studies of levy-paying employers. So that's how large employers are defined within the context of this particular research project. It will only deal with levy-paying employers. And each of these will involve between 3 to 5 semi-structured interviews with people in either senior roles, director roles, or HR roles within an organisation, who can speak to the strategic decisions taken specifically in regards to apprenticeship engagement. Ethical approval for the research has fairly recently been granted by the University of Glasgow and is now underway at this point. I've spoken to several organisations and it's progressing well on that part. Okay. Now, the organisations have been chosen from a range of sectors, okay, to ensure that there's a mix of the old traditional apprenticeship industries I discussed before, as well as the new modern apprenticeship frameworks that now characterise much of the apprenticeship context within Scotland. It will be undertaken from a critical realist perspective, and geographically, this is an important point to make as well for those not from Scotland. There will be an attempt to ensure that it's not focused on the central belt, which has some of the major cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh and so on, because up in previous research demonstrates that employment, particularly recruitment, and the rural communities in the far north of Scotland, for example, recruitment is characterised by much more informal practices. So it has to ensure that all of this is captured within this particular project if it is to be truly representative of Scotland as a whole. As I said, this has been done in conjunction with Skills Development Scotland, who have not only been kind enough to fund my PhD, but they've also been fantastic in terms of helping in the early stages of gaining access to some of these organisations, as well as the support that they gave me in terms of previous research has already helped me get a foot in the door with some of these companies, which has been one of the major challenges of conducting research during the pandemic. Okay, so I don't quite know how long I went on there. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Hopefully I kept within the remit, but what I'll do is I'll just open up for questions if anyone wants to come in.
Paul, You're talking about apprenticeship, right? So obviously in Malaysia, the government have the incentive on apprenticeship during the COVID. But the main issue with this apprenticeship is the program is focusing on the train and hire, not hire and train. So this increased the opportunity for the industry to create a fake apprenticeship, whereby their mission is not focusing on the employment. On the other hand, the government is focusing on the employment. This program was developed to increase the employment. So does this happen? If this happen, what is your further step?
Sorry, I didn't catch that last bit, Haryanti. I do apologise.
We are talking about fake apprenticeship. Okay, I'm talking about the Malaysian situation where we did develop an apprenticeship scheme during the COVID-19. The focus here is to increase the employment, but the structure of the apprenticeship is still train and hire, which by the graduate go for the training, and after that, if they are suitable for the job, they will be hired or employed in the company. But then there's I do believe there's some country are doing the hire and train, whereby they hire first and then they train the graduate. Am I right? This kind of situation in Malaysia increase the fake apprenticeship, whereby the industry are focusing on not focusing on the employment. They got the levy, okay, they just train, and then after the training, they are not employed. The graduate are not getting the employment to the company. So in your opinion, how we want to solve this problem?
Okay, I mean, that's one of the key aspects of the research project, is trying to understand the employer perspective on that. I think in Scotland, I do think that the rate of apprenticeships being hired is quite high. I would need to, I know that relatively recent statistics have been released by Skills Development Scotland, so maybe Mr McCaber can come in and correct me. But I think at the last time I looked at, I think it was 91% of apprentices were kept on following their apprenticeship. That's maybe changed in light of the COVID pandemic, but that's where it was sitting at beforehand. So in terms of, relatively speaking, compared with other countries, Scotland seems to be fairly successful in that regard. It does seem to have quite a high rate of those who complete, who are then kept on. But there are always ways to increase the completion rate, but also the recruitment rate. But as I say, you speak about like training. It's already one of the things that employers are quite happy to have a moan about, in terms of how training costs are met. I think Kristen picked up on that, and everyone wants someone else to pay for it. That's already coming out. I'd imagine that will be something I'll hear exhaustively over the course of the next few months. But in terms of, I guess I don't have any specific answers about how that can be improved at this point. That can only really be determined by understanding the motivations for employers in terms of trying to understand why they take these decisions.
I have like 1,000 questions, but I'll limit myself to only a few hundred. So one of the things we deal with in Australia, and I would say the rate of employment after apprenticeships is very high. Our issue is getting people into apprenticeships, particularly getting people to complete the first year of an apprenticeship. That's when most of the job part occurs. Once they've completed an apprenticeship or a traineeship, they're kind of the same thing. In Australia, traineeships are short-term, generally non-trades. An apprenticeship are traditional trades, then they're generally longer. Once they complete, they generally are employed. But there is an issue, and this is something people love to have a whine about in Australia, with apprenticeship poaching. So because your first year apprentice is like kind of the least useful to the organisation, they're doing a lot of startup training and foundational work. Employers complain that they might take someone on and they'll spend a lot of time over the first year helping that apprentice. And then the apprentice gets to the second or the third year and another company comes in and goes, oh, excellent, we're hiring a third year apprentice, and they take them. Is that something that happens in Scotland?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, Kristen. So I was arranging interviews for next week with a whisky distillery. It's a very Scottish thing to be looking at. And that was exactly what was being discussed, this idea of, and again, what it came back to is it was quite similar in regards to what I said about the fears of recruiting young people because of perceptions about them. And my experience tends to be that if an employer has already been stung by that, they've already experienced that particular thing, then they are more hesitant to continue. So it's definitely a concern that's out there. As I say, I actually have that scheduled for next Thursday, that interview. So I'll have, if we'd done this a week later, I'd have maybe had more of a response on that. But it's absolutely already something that it has came up, and as I say, I don't know that there's likely to be, I don't expect to find widespread evidence of that, but I do expect to find anecdotal evidence from these some directors who've maybe experienced this in the past, and it makes them hesitant.
Yeah, and it's perhaps more important that it's anecdotal than even that it's happening, because it's something they talk about and something they're worried about. And thanks for the presentation. I'll say the Australian approach in terms of levies is, I think, very, very similar. So I'll really be interested to see what the results are on that, and how, there's a lot of similar complaints that the levies aren't really helping, that employers in Australia are basically paid to take on apprentices, and a concern that means that the quality of the training the apprentices are getting is suffering. In relation to COVID, so what we saw with our data, and we'll be publishing on this hopefully later in the year, is we had suspensions rather than cancellations. So we had a huge spike in apprenticeship suspensions, and the government's kind of JobKeeper money, or money that was being paid to employers to keep on any employee, including apprentices, that were kind of suspended from work, the government provided money to keep them on, and that applied to apprentices. Yeah. So the apprenticeships were suspended in huge numbers. The government was kind of paying them to stay on, and then as things calmed down, a lot of those people recommenced, and some of those people withdrew. Is that sort of at all similar to what was going on over there?
In terms of, so the furlough scheme, the coronavirus job retention scheme applied to all jobs in the UK, including apprentices. I think it will be interesting to, there's obviously been a lot of people on apprenticeships, on furlough, and it will be interesting to see, as that scheme is now winding down, what will the impact of that be on those jobs? Well, because there will be people who will have been kept on because of that scheme that may not be beyond September. In terms of apprenticeships, what you did see is there was, quite a dramatic increase in the number of redundancies. And as I say, that was the reason for the Adopt an Apprentice scheme. It's the only scheme of its nature in the UK as well, the one in Scotland. And I remember looking at the statistics, so they released some early stats, and it didn't seem all that promising. But over time, it became an extremely popular programme. And as I say, I think it was over 500 additional redundancies as a result of COVID, but over 300 of them were rehoused, which is quite a significant number. Within a country the size of Scotland, that is a lot. But in terms of suspensions exactly, it would be hard to quantify that just now, but I'd imagine more data on that will become available, particularly as we get to the end of the furlough scheme. Anyone else? Okay, well, we wrap this up, Sarah. What do you think?
Yes, yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Paul. Just to say thank you all for joining the session. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Thank you to Paul, our chair, and to all our speakers as well. Just so you know, the speakers, you can contact them directly on Hoover conference platform. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Slides will be available as well on the delegate resource page early next week if you want to check back onto any of those slides, and you'll also be sent the link to the slides. So yes, huge thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.